maybe getting right into it at the moment. So we heard from the corporates, and I will give you some of their feedback as we have our conversation. But maybe just set out again, because the platform was reconstituted, you became chair. Where do you see at the moment the priorities of the platform, and how does the work of the platform fit into the discussion on sustainable finance and more specifically non-financial reporting?
Thank you, Nick. And it's a pleasure, as always, to be with all of you this morning. Let me very quickly step back, make one step back and explain what's the context, right? In which context, the context that you were explaining, right? Well, it's been 5 years since the Commission published the Sustainable Finance Package. A lot has been achieved, but we also recognize that still a lot needs to be done. And what is interesting is because it's that on one hand, we've moved to implementation time. So that speaks corporates are actually now implementing the package, notably the taxonomy, but also other parts of the sustainable finance regulatory package, and at the same time we're working to finish it. That's I guess a case in point is the taxonomy, and clearly and normally the companies feel a little bit confused, right? I mean, confused because they don't have yet all the answers. The taxonomy, for example, is not finished, and yet they have to implement it. So if you allow me the analogy, it makes me think when I was quite young, I must have been around 14, and I took computers in school. And what I was taught for two years was programming. I did 2 years of Pascal and basics. And a couple of years later, they changed the program. And when you study computers, they didn't teach you to program. They taught you how to use the computer, and they taught you how to use the Microsoft Office package. And that's how it's taught today, because programming is only needed for those who want to be, right, IT engineers or computer scientists. And it's a little bit what's happening now. I think that is perfectly understandable that corporates and financial institutions feel a little bit overwhelmed. They feel that they need to understand the programming because the Microsoft package, the Microsoft Office package, is not yet done. So if you ask me what is our goal and what we're working on, basically is we're trying to support the Commission in developing that Microsoft Office package, and at the same time finish the taxonomy. Now, how does that translate in practice? Well, we already have seen last week, not last week, actually, last week, I lost track of time. The Commission published the June package, where we also was a recall of all the work done in terms of the implementation, the taxonomy compass, the calculator, the FAQ repository, and the user guide. But that's just the beginning. We need so much to do, so much work on it, that we need to reach that moment where corporates, only those who are working on accounting and reporting, need to understand, how to report. And then at corporate level, the rest, they only need to understand the criteria for the activities they conduct. Everything else, they should be able to ignore it, and they should be able to have the tools. For financial market participants, I'm hoping that one day we have a tool that allows for them to calculate automatically the taxonomy alignment, and that they concentrate on how to use it, how to make the most out of the taxonomy, using it as a tool to build their portfolios, whether it is based on revenues or based on CapEx. So to cut a long story short, we're going to be working always. The development of technical criteria is a priority for the platform. So we're going to be working on expanding, looking at those activities that, have not yet been analyzed or not included. Particularly, we're going to start putting emphasis on enabling activities, and all those activities alongside the value chain, which are really important, and I think that the industry has been calling for that.
Thank you very much. I like that comparison, and yes, I suffered through BASIC and Pascal as well, so I feel for you. But I think if taking a few, I just give you a few things. I let you respond to whatever you want, but a few things I took away from the previous panel, which I think fit in quite nicely. One was focus on implementation, not about constantly changing the rules. Was an interesting feedback that I got. The targets are too restrictive. There's too much information required. I think you've answered that in a little way. And kind of particularly when it comes around scope 3 emissions. And then the last one was we need to put a bit more emphasis on the social dimension and the governance dimension as well. So these are some high-level points I took away. How do you see some of those kind of feedbacks from the corporate community feed into the work of the platform?
Right. So in terms of the changes, I fully understand the concerns of like, I'm learning how to use it, but there are being changes. At the same time, this is like the chicken and the egg. At the same time, I'm afraid that there will be some changes, hopefully just tweaks that are needed, because it's only now by implementing, I mean, we need to understand this is such a novel tool. I mean, we are creating the 21st century, accounting system. So we are learning by doing, and obviously those tweaks need to be done in order to make it, work. But hopefully, a lot of those tweaks also come from the experiences of the company, so we can, based on real experience and what their challenges been. And secondly, hopefully there will be minor, but I'm afraid that they will have to expect some of the tweaks. More than on the corporate side, I'm going to the non-financial corporate side. I'm expecting more on the financial side, because we need to understand that the taxonomy, yes, it's the cornerstone, but it's the central piece, but it operates together with other regulations, and some of them particularly close, namely SFDR. And this is what we're concentrating now. We just seen the ESA's consultation that I hope many of you answered to, with very interesting proposals. The Commission also published the usability piece with its 5 measures. Really important, going really in the same direction as the platform, and picking up in some of our recommendations, the need for estimates, taxonomy, alignment, investments, goes without saying, is our sustainable investment, passive funds based on climate transition, or Paris-aligned benchmarks are Article 9 and our sustainable investments, and so forth. Yeah. So I see that there will be more tweaks as we really improve that interaction between the taxonomy, SFDR, benchmarks, and to a lesser extent, but also CRR and Pillar 3. But one that's up and running and which is made, I think that we will be able to say with fairness that, most is established, just a few tweaks here and there. Then you mentioned on scope 3. Let me be a little bit challenging on that, yeah? To start with, I remember when I was at BNP Paribas Asset Management, and the French government, published Article 173 of the Energy Transition Law. We all were, outraged, how they can ask for information that we do not have, the underlying data, it's impossible. Well, can I tell you that what we learned on those first years of implementation, before it became mandatory, for the before the implementation of SFDR, was so important. We started to develop the databases. We started to ask, the internal, group of BNP Paribas employees to really dip into understanding how it works, how you can estimate, what the protocols are, how to do it. We changed it. We changed our voting policy. We changed our engagement strategy. We started collaborating with investors, and so forth, to the point that even before it became even mandatory, we went ahead and they went ahead of and promised to and start reporting on the carbon footprint of all equity and most of fixed income funds. So the bottom line is, we understand it's really difficult. We understand it has to be based a big part on estimates, but you cannot misjudge, or you cannot underestimate how much work, how much they're going to learn and how much things are going to progress, precisely because it's made mandatory. Yeah, I think this is a really important. I think that scope 3 represents on average 83% of the total emissions. Without scope 3, there's no transition, and we have only 27 years left. So, and there is a well-developed protocol. So I think on that one, I'm afraid I need to push back. Did I miss? The S&G, if you want, I can comment on that, but please go ahead.
No, please, maybe respond to that first.
Okay, so in terms of the social and the governance, a couple of things. First, that climate change is first and foremost a social issue. So, saying that, and that the governance of climate is very much embedded in the package and is critical. So to say that the social has been left apart, I don't think it is 100% true. I think that, by tackling climate change, we are actually tackling really important social potential impacts. Now, in terms of the package, well, the due diligence directive has an important social and governance angle, particularly social, and it is not about reporting, it's about behavioral regulation, that it's about complying. The ESRS has an important S&G component, and let's not either underestimate the importance of minimum safeguards and the social and governance indicators on the as principal adverse impact indicators in SFDR. In fact, the ESOs have just made a proposal to enlarge the social indicators. So the one angle I would say, yes, is missing is the social taxonomy. But I think that the Commission made a fair judgment when said, let's first finish this taxonomy, let's learn how it works, let's make it, work smoothly, and then we might, we need to revisit the consideration of developing a social taxonomy.
You raised the importance of the financial services sector, and we will have a panel on that following this conversation. And even when we spoke to Sven, then subsequently there was quite a focus on the SFDR and compatibility of the SFDR with the CSRD, the corporate disclosure framework. Obviously, the SFDR is being evaluated at the moment, and you're contributing to that work. What kind of expectations do you have about changes to the SFDR? Is it more about clarifying, the applicability of definitions around funds? Well, what type of areas for improvements do you see that could be applied in that framework?
Thank you, Nick. A really important question. So let me give you where I believe we should, what we should aim for, right? What the end purpose is. In my opinion, we should have in the future only two types of sustainable investments. Yeah, one is activity-based and should be based on the taxonomy exclusively, but for that we need a complete taxonomy, which means that the do no significant harm apply for those investments that they are not fully aligned with the taxonomy, should be the do no significant harm of the taxonomy. That would be make it consistent, and it would make, crystal clear and no room for greenwashing. And on the other hand, sustainable investments, that operate at entity level. I think there has not been enough emphasis on how different are the approaches when it is through activities, that is revenues or capex aligned, or aligned to a activity that it meets the technical criteria, as opposed to at entity level. What does it mean, sustainable investment at entity level? It means that I'm going to select the companies through one or two indicators, like one factor. For example, emission reductions, right? So is, I don't know, those who have reduced at least 15%, you know, the emissions. Or it could be on energy savings. It can be on the positive side, yeah? Now, for those, it's really interesting because it allows on those to include all sectors, right? It allows for the inclusion of companies who not necessarily are taxonomy aligned, but they also open the door for being supported with the development of a specific benchmarks. In the case of the emission reductions, you have the climate and the Paris Align, which gives that reassurance to investors that over time they're going to, you know, meet their promises, their commitments of that reduction that is expected. Today we only have on climate, we're expecting to develop, and we're starting to work on that, on the different environmental objectives, yeah? But it could also be on social aspects, like on gender or any other. That would make it for sustainable investment. And then you have, you know, Article 8 for all different types of strategies, yes, that would allow equally for strategies that are based, or should allow, that are based on active ownership, a mix, whatever it might be. Now, in the long run, my wish would also be that Article 8, that products disclose the principal areas impacts of those characteristics that they are promoting. So if you say my fund promotes ESG characteristics, so all of them. If my fund only promotes social characteristics, then those. Because as it is now, only disclosing that for a percentage of the fund that responds to sustainable investment, you know, doesn't give any information. And let's remember that it's different to take into account that consider, and it's not clear, you know, it's too complex to know exactly which ones should report on all of them and which ones they should not. I think that that should be. Last but not least, just if you allow me, I think that in the future, and now I'm talking longer term, you know, all financial products should disclose their greenhouse gas emissions, emission reduction targets, and the taxonomy. Because if financial market participants are to transition and meet their entity level goals, then all the portfolios should work towards that end goal, net zero. But I understand that will take a little bit more of time.
Yeah, it's interesting how you kind of broke this down into 4 components, so to speak. 3 currently covered by the SFDR, and then 1 that you think could, in the medium to longer term, be included. Maybe I can drill down on that a little bit more, because your first scenario, the activities that are fully taxonomy aligned, CapEx, OpEx, make sense. Obviously, the industry says at the moment it's a fairly small community, but that's something that should expand over time. On the entity one, maybe you can explore a little. It makes intellectually entirely sense to me, but then it becomes primarily, if I understand you correctly, a benchmarking exercise, putting different entities against each other. How do you measure, so to speak, or at what point does an entity meet the criteria that it can be included or not? I think what's kind of measurement?
Yeah, so remember that this is not to classify Article 8 and 9. This is about the concept of sustainable investment, right? When you're sustainable investment, you need to think it is more the overall impact of your fund, right? So it works like it works today. You're absolutely right that by linking it to the benchmarks, the reason why I am linking it to the benchmark is because ideally, you know, you have a reference point to contrast where you're doing it gives that reassurance that it is really sustainable investment that's really contributing to that environmental objective. Yes, I mean, it's the same thing if you have an ESG fund, it makes sense that you benchmark it against an ESG fund, right? So it's the same concept. In terms of the selection, of course, for each one of the indicators, we would have to look at the ins and outs, but it would basically look a little bit like the benchmarks in best scenario case. But imagine you could also think about mix, an approach that mixes, for example, emission reductions and the solidity of the transition plans with the verification on how the CapEx is being invested, and CapEx, whether, the extent to which is CapEx aligned with the taxonomy. For example, I think that there are plenty of different opportunities. The main difference is that one is based on its bottom up, is saying, you are counting the revenues of the CapEx that they are aligned or will be invested in taxonomy aligned activities. And on the other hand, you're looking at the overall entity and you're looking how it's improving on one performance over time. I hope that it's clearer.
It's a bit clearer, although I do confess, that brings me to your third category, which is basically, as you say, other forms of transition financing, and where you said it would be clearer to see the strategy behind it, more explicitly strategy behind the funds, which makes sense. But the ESAs have taken a decision to effectively widen the scope of that definition recently. And I think the question is ultimately, how do we drive sufficient transition in that third category? Because ultimately any small effort could be seen as a positive transition. So how do we, once we move to that third category of contributing to transition, how do we make that credible and kind of, again, measurable and meaningful?
Yes, it's a very good question and very pertinent, because together, with the usability piece, the Commission published a transition finance piece, which I think speaks exactly to that point. So the first thing is to truly understand how the taxonomy interacts already with transition and transition plans. Yes, because it can be a perfectly Article 9, a company that is 0% taxonomy aligned, it's on oil and gas. It could be up to 100%, imagine, CapEx aligned, and could be perfectly part of an Article 9 product. And remember, some years ago, a green fund, you would never, ever find a company based on CapEx or from the oil and gas sector. So that's the first point. The second point that is also in the Commission's paper that opens the door is saying, look, we understand that sometimes, you cannot on 5 years, and that it might be extended to 10 in special cases, you can actually transform your activity or your assets. Therefore, what it's suggesting is saying, look, as part of your transition plan, then you look at your different activities, if you conduct different activities, or, assets in terms of plants, if you have, and then you say, okay, I might need, 15 years for activity A, or for my first plant or second plant. And then what I need to communicate is how I planned to reach that taxonomy alignment, that, sustainable status. And that can be, you develop your activity plan. You might say, look, I'm going to do 2 or 3 investment plans until I reach that point. In a way, it is introducing the aspect that the platform put forward, last platform put forward, on the extending the taxonomy, right? Which is taking into account that you might move from the do no significant harm into that between do no significant harm, substantial contribution space, or you're making, you're not yet there, but your objective is to be in that green space. And I think that it can in a way, relax many companies, relax in the sense of that they can take for granted, they can be sure that investors are going to, take into account the efforts they're making, but they need to explain how in 27 years they plan to get to that net zero. And by now, we not only need credible transition plans in the lines of the recommendations of the UNHLEC that you very well know, but also there needs to be the proof and how, it's no longer sufficient to have great targets and to have a great goal. You need to prove it. And how do you prove it? Two ways. One is through your CapEx alignment and your CapEx investments and explaining your investment plans. And number two, by reporting annually your emissions reductions, how they are reducing over time.
And I'm conscious of time, maybe just two last questions. I remember very well the conversation we had about the recommendations of the last platform of the traffic light system of red activities, yellow activities, and green activities. And we are indeed talking about the yellow ones and moving them from dark orange to light green to dark green effectively. But it's still a long journey because you can be dark orange and you kind of move from dark orange to middle orange, or you could move from light orange to green. So there are, as you say, a lot depends on the transition plan, the credibility and the speed of the transition plan. A challenge is, of course, that many financial institutions still do not have access to sufficient data and fear they might not have access to sufficient data because of the materiality assessments being taken by the companies themselves. So there might be a disconnect there. Sven didn't see the concern, but I think in the industry we get a little bit of that concern. So the question is just how credible these transition plans are and how quickly that transition can take place and how that impacts the perception of the underlying funds in those different companies and their respective transition plans.
Absolutely, but I would say to investors that they need what they really need to understand is how interlinked transition plans, investment plans, and taxonomy, particularly around CapEx, are. And that there's the information that CapEx alignment is providing them is absolutely crucial because it is understanding how their investments are being made, corporate investments, but it's going to tell them how credible and how trustworthy those companies are. Look, I know that everyone is saying that it's too complex, that it's not yet really working, but the numbers that are coming out this year from companies are really promising. To start with, it's clear that green CapEx is higher than green revenues, and interestingly enough, that is particularly true for the high emitting sectors, that is autos, materials, utilities. There are higher numbers on average of revenue and CapEx alignment, the higher numbers, and actually in real estate and utilities, while energy companies follow closely, with an average aligned CapEx more than 3 times their aligned revenue. That actually means that it is working, and this is really in a moment where companies are still being conservative, and rightly so, because they are, like in unknown territories, the first time they are publishing and they're applying the precautionary principle, which I, fully understand. And when we only have the climate taxonomy as not even completed. So I would say that it is working and that the investors more and more, they're going to start getting the numbers, and all the details, not only in terms of the alignment, but also in transition plans and the other elements. I would be very suspicious of a company whose activities are included in the taxonomy and they don't think that transition plans or the climate indicators are material for them. I would be extraordinarily suspicious as an investor, because the basics of being in the taxonomy is that you can substantially contribute. The only exception to that rule is the enabling activities, where in those cases, yes, there are some, like for example, you are a consulting or engineering service. Well, in that case, I might understand it, but otherwise, really suspicious. The other point I would say is that if I was a company that I would not be included in the taxonomy and my low I have low environmental impact, I would still provide a mini transition plan, even if it is to say, I'm going to renovate, our offices. By the way, that can count as taxonomy aligned, those investments, all the measures for renovation. And I would say we're going to change our, electricity provider, whatever it is, because that makes them much more attractive to investors. So irrespectively of the material assessment, if I was a company, I would definitely provide all the principal adverse impacts transition plans, the emissions, and the key climate indicators, because that is going to increase their chances to access better capital.
I think it's not only capital, it's also just through the value chain, just even doing business, something that we even ourselves are noticing, that we need to provide transition plans to maintain the business with clients that we have, not because of, let's say, direct funding needs. One very last question.
Absolutely.
What do you see as the priorities, the main priorities for the platform? What can we expect? What can the audience expect from you in the course of this year?
Great. I'm really glad you asked me that questions, because I had a couple of calls or asks for companies. Yeah. So the first one is, besides being quite busy with the consultations, let's put it this way, we landed the hard way with the Taxo 6 consultation and the amendments of Article 8. We're now working on SFDR and the ESRS. Besides that, we are working on a compendium of case studies. Yeah. So case studies that are going to look at, on one hand, absolutely transition and strategy, business plans, transition strategy, and net zero commitments. On the second point, we're looking at reporting, the level of quality and granularity of corporate disclosures, and thirdly, on transactions. Yeah, so that's like green finance, sustainability-linked finance across public and private counterparties. So from green bonds, green loans, and so forth. So if they are, for the audience, if they have their case study, if they want to showcase what they've done in any of the three areas, particularly in sectors maybe that they are not always on the spotlight, we will be more than welcome to integrate them, to hear from them. The intention of this work is not only to portray, best practices, but also to be able to identify what those tweaks that I was mentioning before that need to change in order to make it even more, more workable. The second thing that we're also working is on prioritization of the activities that we're going to work on to develop the technical criteria for that. Together with the Commission, there's going to be a stakeholder request mechanism that is asking the industry which activities they think that we should look at and why. So please stay vigilant to when we are going to publish that. We're hoping sometime around September, October. And the third one is that we are also working, as you know, on monitoring capital flows to sustainable investment. This is a totally new task. It's the first time, and the first thing we're doing is developing the methodology. Yeah, there will be a consultation, a targeted consultation, but it will be great if anyone that is listening, that's an expert in the subject, to get to their comments.
Helena, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for being with us and for unpacking some very complex issues, and also for the invitation at the end for industry to feed into the process even more. We will certainly share that word and hopefully we get the appropriate input. Always a pleasure to speak to you. Good luck with the work on the platform and all the other things you're doing, and hopefully speak soon again.
Thank you so much to everyone for listening, and thank you very much, Nick, for inviting me and for always thinking of the platform.
Of course. It all started with the platform, or well, the advisory group that then became a platform.